Hey folks, welcome back to People Are Complicated and our mini-series where we are talking to talent, learning, and development folks about how do we help all these complicated people learn to work better together and truly develop them at scale. Today we are talking with Heather Campbell, and she has a 25-year corporate career. Most of that time was actually spent at a hyper-growth tech company where she was there from 3,000 to 33,000 employees and headed up learning and development for part of that organization that was hiring 800 people a year at one point. And she talks about how as they were scaling, she started getting requests for more learning opportunities for people, more courses and workshops. And she realized courses and workshops aren't going to solve what we really need to solve. We have a cultural challenge and we need to turn this around. So you will get to hear what did she do that actually improved people's participation in learning opportunities, but also employee engagement surveys, retention, and when all of that happens, actual business results. How did she build that program or those programs? What were the results she saw? How long did it take? All of that we are going to dive in today. And I'm excited for you to get to take a listen. All right, Heather, thank you so very much for joining us today on People Are Complicated. I would love, you started to already tell me, give us a quick overview of your career.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me on. I love what it is that you're doing, and I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm the founder and CEO of a small company called CultureQI. And what we're focused on is working with leaders, small and mid-sized companies that are building their organization to help them activate healthy, high-performing cultures. And we do that through leadership development and talent management programs. So that's really the foundation of our focus, is making sure that leaders, managers have the right behaviors, and that the HR programming has the right talent management infrastructure to make sure that your talent can thrive, because they're your most investment, at the end of the day. So that's what we focus on doing. And my history and my background is about 25 years, I hate to say it, but 25 years in corporate. And I have worked everywhere from super small companies, 2 people, to mid-sized companies, to nonprofit organizations. And then my last 20 years was spent with a high-growth tech company that I got to see grow from 3,000 to 33,000. So it was a pretty awesome run at that organization. Wow. And to go through so many iterations in its growth cycle was really fantastic.
11x growth.
Yeah, right? It's pretty awesome to watch. And what an amazing opportunity when you are in an organization that is hiring so much and growing so much, to be able to focus on the development of your talent and the retention of your talent and the creation of healthy cultures that you can continue to, hopefully achieve the results. So I was very happy and lucky. I feel fortunate in my career to have had that opportunity and to be able to work on something that I'm really passionate about.
And what great context for everyone to hear. You have seen so many iterations of company size and probably a lot of things that worked and a lot of things that didn't work when it came to developing people, and scale was the name of the game for you. So, you know how this podcast goes. I only have 2 questions for you, Heather. What in developing people at scale was your biggest hurdle?
I would say the biggest challenge was when I took over the learning and development strategy for the organization that was growing the most throughout the company. We were hiring right out of college, and it was a super busy time. We had cohort sizes that were about 100 people with every team that we onboarded, and we were running close to, I'd say, 800 annually new associates or new employees that we're bringing on into the organization.
Wow.
And that was a pretty substantial just challenge to figure out in and of itself. But because it was a new position that I got asked to work in, I had all these leaders starting to come to me and wanting to solve other business problems with a class, with training. Once they had someone who knew something about learning and development, it was, hey, can you go fix this? And can you go fix this? And it became very clear that there were other things amiss in the culture and other things that were lacking in terms of structure or strategy or skill that wasn't going to be entirely solved by education. And
Mm.
that really started my journey in organizational development. And there were some leadership behaviors that were, I would say, either outdated, to say it kindly, or maybe those leadership behaviors just were underdeveloped. People, because we had grown so fast, had moved into roles without having the appropriate skill. And it had created, unfortunately, not the best culture. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was toxic, but it wasn't as healthy as it could be.
Yeah.
And we needed to remedy that because we were building and bringing on so many people into this organization. They were happy when we hired them. They were happy for the first 2 years of employment. And then at the 2-year mark to the 5-year mark, they all started to leave. So we had to look really deep in terms of what was going on and how do we turn that around. And so we dug in and we instituted a really aggressive strategy for organizational development. And we worked it at all levels. We worked it from the top down, from the highest VPs and training all the executives, from the bottoms up, programming that we instituted and rolled out for new employees as well as long-term employees and all the manager levels. So we worked it at all levels, and it took us about 3 years for us to start seeing substantial improvement. But we did. We saw improvement in reducing our turnover. We increased our employee satisfaction and engagement, and we improved business results because of it. But it was a long project. It was a hard strategy to kind of execute over a multitude of years and quarters. But without a doubt, by the end of it, we could say we made a substantial difference in the performance of the organization. So I would say that was the biggest challenge that turned out to be a success, fortunately.
Yeah. So it was, people started coming to you asking for classes and workshops, and you dug in and realized, there's a deeper root here. These are symptoms, but the
Yep.
disease is more in the culture, and we need some fundamental shifts to happen here. And so you put together programming that was for everything from the highest level leadership all the way down to, the newest hires and every single employee in the organization. What topics were you hitting on? What was this programming? What were you educating on? Or was it all just topics and education, or were there other pieces involved?
Great question. So there were quite a few things that we focused on in terms of the education. I will say we approached education not just as learn a skill and then never apply it, right? For education to stick, you got to be able to apply it, and it needs to come with a change in behavior. And so we did approach it with behavior change. We had to work with the leaders quite a bit on how to build trust, how to create trust with their employees, with their team members. And it likewise worked for the clients too, right? But how do you go about creating an environment where people trust you and you trust them? So we spent a lot of time on developing that. We discovered that feedback was a huge skill that was lacking, both giving and receiving feedback. And so we had to train and implement systems and new processes to really encourage a continuous feedback process. Even conflict was hard. Like, I think people have a really negative connotation to conflict. And if you really want to be innovative, you've got to have debate, right? You have to have constructive dialogue.
Absolutely.
You've got to be able to challenge each other. And that wasn't happening like it needed to happen. I don't know if you're familiar with Kim Scott's book,
Oh, yes.
Radical Candor. We love it.
Yes.
Our culture, and we did this by actually interviewing hundreds of people, but our culture was sitting in the bucket of ruinous empathy.
Yep. You and probably 85% of most modern companies. Yeah.
We were always nice. We just didn't want to rock the boat. We didn't want to raise any sort of alarms or situations or issues. And that was really impeding us from delivering the best results, performing and innovating like we needed to. So we had to go address, how do we get to that place of radical candor with care and break people of habits of not wanting to rock the boat.
Yeah.
So I mean, that in of itself was a challenge to do, to get people's behavior to just be different than what it was that they're programmed to do. So I'd say those are kind of the specific, some of many, I mean, it was many, but those were some of the specific skills or behaviors we were really trying to embed within the organization, because they're pretty foundational, right? For I think any healthy team dynamic needs to have that as base. And
Yep.
we had to lay it, because it did not exist.
Yeah. How did you measure behavior change?
Great question. You've got to look at how does it, for us, we were looking at how often someone was delivering feedback. So as an example, so feedback was a big one. We needed feedback to not go up what we called kind of the feedback chain, if you will, where how our team was organized, and I actually think more people are moving into this dynamic, or this structure. We had project managers who were over team members who did not report to them, right? Because they were client project managers. So they could have a team of 30, they could have a team of 130. So something would happen, feedback would happen, and all of a sudden it wasn't even all of a sudden, it would just go up, it would get escalated, it would come back around and eventually hit the employee. And that employee maybe heard it, if they were lucky, a month after the fact. Sometimes it would be within the quarter, or sometimes it would be in their annual review. I mean, that is how ridiculous that process went. And think at the time, I mean, you're smiling like you actually have experienced this before.
It's painful. It's painful to think about. Like you're receiving feedback on something you might not even remember happened, you know?
It's just not effective. It's not efficient. And so we really worked on driving the behaviors of feedback that were to give it directly, no running about to someone else's manager or escalating up the train. If you have feedback, you're going to give it to the person directly, and you're going to deliver that feedback within 3 days of you receiving something, or you observing something. And then we also worked on the behavior of asking for feedback, so that at any opportunity, whether it's after a client meeting or after a presentation, you can absolutely follow up with someone and say, hey, what feedback do you have for me? Or can you tell me 2 things I did great, 2 things that I would do better? So we got very granular, and that was the behavior that we wanted people to do. Give it directly, give it timely, right? Within 3 to 5 days at most. And then also adopt the behavior of asking for feedback. We trained everyone on it. I mean, we leaders all the way down to new associates and new employees. We trained on that. And then, what we would measure in terms of behavior is, how often those managers in their one-on-ones were asking for feedback, how quickly issues that might happen at a client site would be getting resolved from the project manager, because they no longer were escalated elsewhere and then come back to it a month later. And just shortening the time in which someone, by the way, most people want feedback. They want to hear if you're doing something wrong, right?
Yes.
They want to hear it.
Yeah.
So just reducing the time in which they're hearing it. And then we put on our annual survey, and we would run a bunch of other surveys too, like, are you getting feedback? And we saw measurable improvement in employees answering the question that they were receiving feedback regularly from their managers and the project managers. So that at the end of the day showed that we were making that culture shift, that behavior change, to lead to a better place. And guess what? Our client scores went up as well. No surprise. Customer scores also improved.
So that's one of those things about organizational development where it's like it's hard to say ROI on something because it you can only prove correlation, not causation at scale, right? Especially when you're working with tens of thousands of people, right? When you hear more and more of those stories of, hey, if you can show something measurable that indicates that culture has shifted, you will also see that the things that bring in revenue are also improving. You will have more innovation. You will have shorter timelines. You will have, because you have more of that radical candor, psychological safety, those behaviors that create the trust and the relationships so that people can bring their best perspectives without, keeping them locked inside out of ruinous empathy that really isn't helping anybody because it's ruinous.
For sure. And I think we had to really retrain how people thought about feedback.
Yeah.
And conflict. That's where this really training came in because we had to teach them not just some frameworks on how to deliver feedback, but mostly is what happens to you internally when you're receiving feedback. Where does your brain go? Why are you going to a fight, flight, freeze place where you start to shut down or you start to challenge and everything you're hearing, you just now are putting through a filter of rejection of what it is that you're hearing. We really helped people understand this is why it feels the way it feels and why you're so scared of delivering it or receiving it. And then we just practiced. I mean, we did a lot of practice. I mean, I made leaders who, maybe weren't very good. Maybe they were good at giving feedback to people below them, but they could never give feedback to their peers, and they certainly couldn't give feedback to their leaders above them. We made them practice giving feedback to each other, giving feedback to their leader. Those were all really critical new skills that we had to develop and then help them do it on a regular basis. But it made the biggest difference.
Practice is so important, especially with those uncomfortable things.
Yeah.
How did you do that at scale? I mean, you couldn't sit down with, groups of 10 at a time across 33,000 people. How did you scale
our team
that?
was only 3,000, so that's just small, right?
At that point, yes. Okay, good. Well, and that's actually a really important part. You laid the foundation of culture before significant growth. That actually probably played.
Let me clarify. So I was just part of the high growth organization within the big company. So I was focused on organizational development.
Okay, so then how did you just, only with 3,000 people go 10 groups of 10 at a time? How did you really scale that? Because 3,000 is still quite a bit.
No, it's just not that. It's not that. Well, it started out at the leadership level. So we ran leadership development training for 70 leaders. I think we broke them down into 6 cohorts maybe over the course of multiple quarters and started to get it down through them. So they started to operate differently within their team. Then we trained up those leaders who started to implement that same practice and training at their team levels with their managers. We embedded it into manager training. We embedded it into new hire training. So all new associates or new employees that we were bringing on started to get that training for feedback. And I mean, it was required learning. It was like just having to do compliance or some regulatory WBT web-based training you had to do. This was part of what we did. And the training that we developed, we moved it from in-person to online. You receive the content, practice the content, and then it wasn't just online. You actually had to do a practicum, if you will, a course where you had to actually do it and practice that giving of feedback with someone in a safe environment so that you could start doing it with your team. So that's it. And you think about it when it comes to behavior change, training is just one. It's an important lever, but it's one of many things that you have to do. We implemented marketing campaigns. We really talked about the importance of feedback and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And we branded it. I can't even remember at this point what it was, but we kind of branded it in a fun way. And we encouraged it in every type of forum where we were talking to leaders or managers. And people started to really identify that this is how I get better, this is how my team gets better, and this is ultimately going to lead us to a place that allows us to be higher performing than we are today. So it became comfortable with practice and over time.
That's amazing. So what I hear, if I was going to summarize everything you're saying, is you started getting inundated with requests for education, and you said, well, hold on now, let's step back. Let's see what's really going on underneath the hood here. You got into it. You saw, hey, this is a cultural, across my group, this is a cultural issue around not giving feedback and not being able to receive feedback, and people just being, quote, nice in a way that is not helping us actually do our best work, innovate, solve problems, get things done on time, meet budgets, all of that kind of thing. This is affecting all the business outcomes. It's a cultural root of not being comfortable with the hard conversations.
That's right.
And so we are going to hone in on that and develop that not only through education, but also through application. If you think of like the 70-20-10 model, like we're going to get this in the application, in the flow of work. And we're going to get people to practice this. And we're going to do this at every single point of the major milestones in the employee life cycle. We're going to do it in onboarding. We're going to do it when you get promoted. We're going to do it when you are in a rising leader program. We're going to put it in all of it. And the beauty of that is you created a common shared experience where everyone has the language, not just some people in some cohort, but everyone across the company had this language of feedback. Radical candor. We're going to give feedback. I'm going to receive feedback. I'm going to ask for feedback. I'm going to ask for specific feedback. I love that you use radical candor. I'm such a fangirl.
That became part of our vernacular. I mean, it absolutely became what 3,000 people were talking about in terms of, oh man, can I have some radical candor here? It was how they introduced uncomfortable things that maybe they just would not have been comfortable doing beforehand. But you know what? It took time. It did not happen overnight.
No, you said 3 years, really, before you started to see.
And feedback was one of multitude of things that we had to shift in the organizational dynamic to really get things moving in the right direction. We couldn't really institute feedback until there was trust. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't introduce the next level of conflict, constructive, positive, healthy conflict, until feedback was in place. So we really found that we had to get some of these foundational things instituted into the culture and be really behaving before we can move on to the next level.
Well, Heather, I feel like we covered so much ground. Is there anything that we didn't cover that is either a really great learning or, like a pitfall to avoid or a trick that people might not expect that could help them bring success when they're developing people at scale?
I think it's really important to, number one, have a strategy and know that it's going to take something like this: organizational change, culture change, behavior change, that needs to be scaled across a pretty large audience. Is not going to turn overnight. So you have to really make sure you have that strategy outlined and are thinking through all the various components from a behavior standpoint of what needs to change systematically to be able to make those changes inevitable. You've got to look at processes. You've got to look at tools. You've got to look, of course, at training. You've got to look at, how to motivate people intrinsically and socially, create an environment, a peer environment that's going to apply positive peer pressure. There's just so much you have to look at to be able to tackle something that's really going to stick. So I think that's the most important thing in building that strategy and executing the strategy. And by no means did I keep that to myself and my team. Every leader knew that, number one, this problem that you've tasked me to solve is not my problem. Like, y'all created the problem. Yeah. And you all are going to solve the problem, and I'm going to help you solve the problem.
Right.
Right. And so I got them involved at every single level of executing that strategy.
So good.
And certainly we had to change it and it had to evolve every year. I mean, that strategy is still ongoing. I would say 8 years in, like we are just making, incremental improvements and going deeper into a new area, or something else has come up that we need to go solve for. But that strategy is still very much in place because it just became part of how the organization functioned in terms of how do we set ourselves up? How do we set our talent up to be the most effective that they can be? And let's evaluate holistically all the things that we need to do better and differently to make that happen. And we were able to take that strategy through, I think we went through 3 to 4 vice president changes during that time frame.
Wow.
And, they were kind of coming in and moving out, and we were able to keep that moving and solid throughout that time
Amazing.
period, which ultimately led to a better place, right? A better culture, better behavior, better team performance.
How incredibly rewarding. Heather, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing with other people strategy leaders as well.
I love sharing and wish everyone well on their organizational development and culture endeavors.
Heather, if people want to get in touch with you, if they are trying to figure out how do they change their culture, if they are, dealing with some similar issues, how can people get more of your wisdom?
Well, I welcome sharing it with whoever wants it or needs it. Culture is a passion of mine for sure. You can visit my website at cultureqi.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, both CultureQI as well as me, Heather Campbell. And I'd love to talk to business leaders who are at that stage in their organization where they're going to be hiring. Or maybe they have just hired and things feel out of control. Maybe they weren't intentional about thinking about their culture or really laying the right foundation to help them further scale. That is really the opportune time to lay the right behaviors, the right infrastructure that's going to allow you to have consistently high performing teams. I certainly can come in and help if things are turning around or they're absolutely chaotic and bad and unhealthy and toxic. I have done that. But I believe in the power of starting at those small businesses at the beginning and helping them get it right so that they don't have to rework all those problems later.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Heather.
You're welcome.
Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of People Are Complicated. As with everything we do here at Cloverleaf, this mini-series has been a labor of love with many cross-functional folks involved. So special thank you to Evan Schultz for helping to set up things that really got us guests in the door. Thank you to Nicole Tiffany for video production, video editing, design, thumbnails, all things that have made this look good, including this mural behind me and the lighting around me. And also thanks to Evan Doyle for all the execution support you get to make this a thing that happens, that is published out in the world, that is seen on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And also thanks to Jake Owens for video editing support on getting this out on socials. I also want to say that if you are a talent learning and development person and you want to be included on our episodes, you can always reach out to me just directly on LinkedIn, Kirsten Moorfield. That's the best place to really find me and get in touch with me. Just DM me there, send a connection request. If you are also interested in what the heck is Cloverleaf and what do we do, let me tell you. This episode is brought to you by the company that I run in my day job, Cloverleaf.me. I am the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Cloverleaf, where we have invented what we call automated coaching. We take the common behavioral assessments and strengths assessments like Clifton Strengths, DISC, Enneagram, 16 types, what you've already invested so much into, and we turn it into just-in-time coaching nuggets that are pushed to people in the tools they work in every day. So Slack, email, Microsoft Teams, calendar, and we coach people on how do you do your best work today? What are some blind spots you might have? What are just nuggets that you need to know to be successful? But of course, nobody works on an island. We work through each other, with each other. So the most important aspect is this communal collective development that we have created where you are getting coaching on the people around you. Who are you going to meet with? What's the group dynamic in the room? If you're having conflict with somebody, just type in what you need help with, and our tool will give coaching to your folks right there in the flow of work. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can find out on cloverleaf.me. And of course, if you have enjoyed this episode, if you've gotten any good nuggets out of it, or you know other people who you would like to share it with, please just share it directly, share it on your LinkedIn or wherever you prefer to be social on the internet. And of course, leave a review wherever you are listening or watching this. If you leave us a review, it really helps more people find us. Thank you so much for tuning in. More next time.